So a few weeks ago, the American Rocketry Challenge announced the Kerbal Rocketry Challenge. The challenge was to build a rocket that can carry 3 Kerbals to the Mun, land at least one on the surface of the Mun to plant a flag, and then return all 3 safely to the surface of Kerbin. There were some restrictions, including a limited inventory of parts, no part clipping, and a 250,000 fun maximum cost for the rocket. Designing the cheapest rocket, read, safety features come second, could win your TARC team $3,000. And thus, on July 28, 2020, the design process for the KSS 6 feet apart Mark 6 began. A basic idea of rocket science is that of delta V. It's basically a quantity that describes how much a rocket can change its speed. Much like in real life, there are delta V maps for the objects in the Kerbal system. They list the delta V requirements a rocket needs to produce in order to achieve specific orbits, captures, or intercepts around celestial bodies. The total delta V required for a rocket to land on the Mun and return to Kerbin is approximately 5,900 meters per second. But the initial 3,400 meters per second to get out of the atmosphere is fairly variable, depending on ascent profiles, and is actually quite hard to calculate. However, we can still use this number as a good ballpark figure to begin designing a suitable rocket. The first successful design was just that, a ballpark but suitable rocket. Dubbed the KSS Who Needs RCS Thrusters, Mark 6. It mimicked a lot of the features that the stock Kerbal X had. This rocket had plenty of room for improvement though. The large command pod is a very good pod for regular KSP gameplay, but it is very expensive and requires large modules, which add to the costs. In addition, this rocket still contained monopropellant, which is completely unnecessary. The removal of all monopropellant in the crew capsules inspired the name for the next success, called the KSS No Mono Mark II. Featuring stacked single crew capsules, this was the first design that enforced strict social distancing between crew members. Since stacked crew capsules aren't very aerodynamic, a fairing was added to decrease drag while passing through the atmosphere. The lander stage also had less fuel, making the lander more stable overall. The KSS Distancing Mark II sought to decrease the liquid fuel carried by the main ascent stage and also featured a revolutionary heat shield system, as in, there's no heat shielding at all. While a successful design, the KSS Distancing Mark II only served as an intermediate step towards the KSS 6 feet apart Mark 6. Social distancing policies were applied to every part of the rocket, which meant that the main ascent stage could only carry 2 large solid rocket boosters. On the sides of each SRB are 2 smaller SRBs, which provide just barely enough thrust to launch the rocket. The liquid fuel tank was returned to its original size, and the heat shield has just barely enough ablator to keep the crew capsules from burning up in the atmosphere. A drogue chute was also added after some intense debate as to whether crew survival was worth the 150 fun investment. The optimal way to launch a rocket is by doing something called a gravity turn. By cutting down everything on a rocket, it becomes the only way to launch it. This forum post explains how to properly pull off a gravity turn in KSP. The KSS 6 feet apart follows the same general idea, but with some modifications. You may have noticed that all of the designs didn't have one crucial thing: fins. A good gravity turn requires an aerodynamically stable rocket. None of these designs are. Instead of relying on fins, which add weight and cost funds, the KSS 6 feet apart depends on SAS to not flip over during ascent. With that said, we can now launch. We want to maintain a thrust-to-weight ratio of about 1.5 while we're still in atmosphere, so that drag effects are minimized. The ascent follows the rest of the steps in the forum post, except the SAS module is used to mimic gravity pulling down on the rocket's trajectory. Lots of trial and error show that keeping just left of the prograde vector while in atmosphere was the optimal way to enter orbit. The KSP equivalent of the Kármán line is 70 kilometers above Kerbin's surface. At that point, aerodynamic effects are no longer a thing, and the fairing is ejected. All remaining delta V in the ascent stage is thrown into increasing orbital velocity as much as possible, but the lander will still have to expend a bit over 100 meters per second of delta V to completely circularize. We move to prepare a Hohmann transfer. Hold on a minute, you might say. Isn't a ballistic capture a much better choice for a video game competition where you need to minimize absolutely everything about a rocket? And you would be correct. However, KSP uses the patched conic approximation to simulate gravity, and as such, it only involves 2 massive bodies at once. A ballistic capture requires the existence of Lagrange points, which in turn needs an M-body simulation of gravity to pull off. While there is a mod that does this, stock KSP is unable to. While a bi-elliptic transfer is technically possible, the delta V savings are too minute to be of any significance. TMI requires approximately 860 meters per second of delta V to pull off, with some extra for course corrections. We aim for a Munar periapsis of approximately 6,000 meters above the surface so as to avoid tall hills on the Mun. Setting a thrust limit on our Poodle engine lets us fine-tune the intercept. At this point, I did a little screen shake because I was very happy at the inclination. Having an orbit this close to the ecliptic was not something I could do consistently, given that the ascent stages could easily create deviations in orbital inclination. It also helps slightly with delta V efficiency. After circularizing, we want to pick a good landing spot. By avoiding craters and hills, we can get around the worst of the inclines. The optimal landing trajectory is just a gravity turn in reverse, called a suicide burn, but I approximated it with short bursts of the engine before going into a continuous burn. The landing legs have a crash tolerance of 12 meters per second, but because KSP physics is pretty buggy, we have to go well below that to keep our Poodle engine from clipping into the terrain and braking. And we're on the Mun. While we only needed to put one Kerbal on the surface, doing so would drastically increase the complexity of the lander and add to the cost. The delta V savings for an Apollo-style landing just wasn't worth it. Well, yeah, we only have 1,041 meters per second of delta V left. All that matters is that we have enough. Re-entering lunar orbit leaves us with 429 meters per second of delta V for a Kerbin capture. My mouse goes a bit crazy because I realized that we could complete the mission. We budget 220 meters per second of delta V for capture and save the remaining 200 or so for burn at Kerbin apoapsis. Making a 185 meters per second delta V burn and then doing some course corrections brings our Kerbin periapsis down to 40 kilometers, with 32 meters per second of delta V remaining. Ah, but that's not enough to circularize, you may say. And you would be correct. But this is the final bit of science that saves us massive amounts of funds. We make use of a maneuver known as aerobraking. We basically use the atmosphere of a planet to slow ourselves down from orbital speeds. 40 kilometers above the surface of Kerbin provides a thick enough atmosphere to slow the lander at an appreciable rate while not destroying any of its components.
The world can be one together, cosmos without hatred, stars like diamonds in your eyes. The ground can be space, 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 with feet marching towards a peaceful sky. All the moon men want things their way, but we make sure they see the sun.
After a few passes, our apoapsis dips below 100 kilometers, and we can say goodbye to our engine. The stack of capsules can continue landing on its heat shield.
Deja vu, I just been in this place before. Higher on the street, and I know it's my time to go. Going new, and the search is a mystery. Standing on my feet, it's so hard when I try to be me. Oh, deja vu, I just been in this place before. Higher on the beat, and I know it's a place to go. Going new, and the search is a mystery. Standing on my feet, it's so hard when I try to be me. Yeah.
On landing, we bid adieu to our heat shield for absorbing some impact. It doesn't actually matter since these crew pods have a crash tolerance of 14 meters per second, which is more than enough for landing. And thus concludes the mission. I took the 3 Kerbals out for a quick picture and then put them back into the pods for submission. I swear, if a stack of SRBs beats this design by like 7,000 funds, I will be very mad. Oh well. We shall see.
Goodbye, moon man. You say goodbye, moon man. Goodbye, moon man. Goodbye, moon man. Oh, goodbye. Cosmos without hatred, diamond stars of cosmic light, quasars shine through endless nights, and everything is one in the beauty. And now we say goodbye, moon man. You say goodbye.